Welcome to Conservation Unfiltered, a podcast all about the North American model of conservation and your chance to dive into conversations about trends, research, and outdoor activities. It's time to get wild with the 2021 Conservation Media Award-winning host, Jason Creighton.
That's the biggest thing that I see with a lot of individuals. Like, I mean, you can even research it online, and it's like, okay, make sure you cook your wild game to well done to make sure it kills everything. It was like, well, you just killed the game. That's what you did. You just completely destroyed it.
You're listening to the Conservation Unfiltered podcast presented by Conserve the Wild. I'm your host, Jason Creighton, and this is episode number 111, Wild Game Cooking 101. First off, happy holidays and happy new year to everyone, and welcome to season 5 of this podcast show. Today, we're going to be talking with Paul Rhoades. Paul is the founder of Sizzlin Arrow Outdoors and the host of a podcast by that exact same name. He's also a former chef. So what are we going to be talking about during this episode? Basically, we're going to be talking about, real quick, how to procure some venison, how to process it down, how to store it, and some do's and don'ts when cooking. Paul being a former chef, myself being a culinary high school teacher, we have a little bit of knowledge in this aspect, and we want to share what we think and our opinions on this matter. And then towards the end, we will share our favorite recipes for venison, so make sure you stick around. Hey, everybody on the line today, Paul Rhoades. Paul, how you doing today?
I'm doing good, Jason. How are you, man?
I'm doing great. Happy holidays to you. This is going to be the first episode of the new year for 2022. Hopefully better than the last couple years, right? With everything going on.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah, fingers crossed, definitely. So what I want to talk about today, and as I mentioned in the intro that everyone just heard, I figured it would be really good to start the year off with how to cook wild game meat. You're a hunter, I'm a hunter. A lot of the listeners are hunters or are interested in it. And I feel like even if you are like myself that grew up hunting family, game meat was cooked all the time. It wasn't always necessarily the best foot forward for that game meat, the way it was cooked, right? The old school way sometimes is great, right? There's some great old school recipes out there. But then, we now know a little more how wild game works and how it reacts to heat and things like that. So the hope today was basically to talk about favorite recipes, all that kind of thing, start the new year off. For the most part, at this point, everyone's seasons are pretty much over. There might be a couple stragglers out there, but what do we do with this game meat now to, sort of give it our best foot forward and really highlight the great textures, the great flavors that we can utilize this game meat with. And I thought, who would be a better person to join me on this podcast? As myself being a culinary teacher, as you being a former chef, I felt like this could be a great conversation between the two of us. So before we start, I want to talk real quick. You're the founder of Sizzlin Arrow Outdoors. What is Sizzlin Arrow Outdoors, and sort of what's that mission? What is your purpose with that company?
Yeah, for sure, Jason. Thank you for the question. So really, Sizzlin Arrow, we're a newer organization, but what we focus on primarily is consulting individuals on wild game harvesting and food preparation. So, I mean, we've got a very large scope, and that's just really summing it up into a nutshell. But I mean, I've got Sizzlin Arrow podcast. I've got my local things that I do here. I take new upcoming hunters out on one-on-one guided hunts, which I've got 3 of those lined up for this week, which is going to be fun. I've got a 10-year-old boy coming along with me on a hunt, and I've got 2 first-time hunters going out with me as well. So yeah, it's a lot of fun just watching people grow and teaching them the tricks of the trade, and then also showing them what to do with that animal after that animal has been harvested, and just how to field prep it, how to bring it back, how to cut it up yourself, how to package it, how to cook it, and just really utilize the animal to the best of our ability, whether it's, using the bones for stock, or saving the inside, like the heart, the liver, use those for different recipes, dehydrating the lungs, the trachea for dog chews, stuff like that. There's even a place here, Hunters Feeding the Hungry, that makes gloves for veterans. So disabled veterans and stuff, they'll make gloves out of the hide. So I'm working on connecting with them and seeing if we can work out to where we take, the leftover doe hides or the back end of the bucks that are not being utilized for the mounts and whatnot. But a lot of great things. And we have a few other things we're working on the pipes, but I'm not going to mention those quite yet, because it's still in the works, and we're not quite sure how that's going to pan out. So I'll definitely let everyone know as soon as we have a for sure on the new things coming.
Yeah, man, that's great. I love the idea of sort of helping people through that whole process, right? Especially people that aren't, that haven't grown up with it, right? Because that's one of those barriers to entry for hunting is, what do I do? How do I do it? And then, once you get that animal down, now what do I do? I always say, like, okay, now I say to myself every time that I shoot a deer, now the work starts.
Yep,
right? Like the easy part is over. Not that hunting is easy, but the easy part is over. Now the work starts of getting it out of the woods, breaking it down. And then the fun part will eventually start, which is, for me, cooking it and sharing it with other people, or eating it myself. That's always a great time. So, let's start with that sort of procurement aspect of wild game meat. In the United States and Canada, you're not allowed to purchase wild game meat. So, we have no market hunting. So how do people go about procuring it? Which I know could be an entire podcast in and of itself, multiple episodes. So let's just go with like the quick, easy, like if someone's interested, what should they do?
Okay, gotcha. So there's a lot of different ways you can go about this. I mean, really the easiest way, if you don't want to get your hands dirty, if you just want to try it to see if it's even something that you like, I guarantee one of your neighbors, one of your coworkers, somebody that hunts. So, or somebody that knows somebody that hunts, and you could probably ask them if they could get you a little bit of venison or whatever wild game meat they have. And more than likely, most sportsmen are happy to share a little bit of their meat. I mean, you may get ground meat, you may get roast meat. Some are very generous and give you some backstrap if they want, but not. I usually don't share my back straps. Yeah, I'll give you the ground meat.
Listen, I don't. I'll be very honest, and I'm selfish. The only way I'm sharing backstrap is if I'm cooking it for you and we are eating together.
Exactly. But so the other one is, if you know someone that does hunt, you can ask them to take you out. Of course, in most states, I believe it's every state, they require a hunter safety certificate. Some states are a little more stringent. Like some states, you have to have your hunter safety card, then you have to have your archer's hunter safety card. So you have a few different ones. North Carolina is just the one and done. So you can get that and then go out and try to harvest one yourself. I mean, one reason why we are doing what we're doing is I grew up in Wyoming, and I did a lot of Western big game hunting, mule deer, antelope, a little bit of elk. But that's a whole different animal than whitetail hunting. So when I moved out east and started whitetail hunting, I felt like I was a brand new hunter. I had no idea really how to go about it, because mine was used to spot and stalk, and you can see for miles, and you see them and you go out and get them. Here you got to work on the ambush type thing. So really where I'm going with that is with new hunters, if you have someone that can take you out, if you don't know really what to do, it can be anywhere from getting information on right clothing, right equipment, how to prep and seal your clothing to keep it scent free. And then, of course, going out and looking for the spots where the deer are traveling through, best place to set up stands, how soon to set up stands in the year. Cameras help with that too. But I mean, it's a process. It definitely is a process. And if you have a mentor that you can go out with, and I know, Jason, I'm sure you've taken a few new hunters out there, and I'm always open, and I'm sure Jason is too. But I'm never opposed to answering an email or taking a phone call if anyone has any questions.
Yeah, trying to get new people out there that are interested. That's something, just like you, it's a passion for me, right? Like I want to
Mhm.
share my passion of hunting with other people. And if someone shows interest, I'm all for it. Actually, just this year, one of my coworkers that I helped sort of, not as much as I would have liked because of COVID and everything going on, but
Mhm.
he was able to harvest his first deer this year, which was great. And then I was actually telling another coworker that story, and that coworker decided, I've been thinking about for a while, hey, maybe this year's the year that I give it a shot. So, like I said, it's hunting's a passion of mine, and I like to be able to share that passion with other people, just as you do, obviously, right?
Mhm.
You started a whole company based around it, so
Yeah.
that is, like I said, that's in a nutshell, right? Like that is how you get you base, and I love the fact that you sort of mentioned two ways to go about it, right? You can
Mhm.
either have a friend or a coworker or someone that already hunts give some to you, right? Like you can't, by law, you can't pay them for it.
Yep.
You can't trade services for it. They can give it to you just as a sort of donation out of their own good heart, right? And then you can go ahead and cook that meat, or you can go out and get it yourself. Like I said, whole big thing that we
Yep.
could talk about for days. So let's just move on to the aspect of you have now harvested an animal. You've now killed an animal. It could be a white-tailed deer. It could be small game. It could be a bear, right? As
Mhm.
long as it's a legal harvest, uh, we now need to go through the process of breaking it down, figuring out what we're gonna, getting it out of the woods, all that kind of stuff. Um,
Yep.
Instead of going through like step by step, like hopefully people know, and I guess if you don't, I'll go through it real quick. You have to remove the entrails out of that animal. You need to remove the animal from the field or the woods, right? If it's a pheasant, it's pretty easy. Throw it in your game bag, you can walk out. If it's a deer, either drag it out, or even a bear, you could put it in a side by side and drive it out if you have access, or a lot of Western hunters, which I'm sure you did in your in years past before you moved east, you quarter it, you sort of break it down so that you can put it, in a backpack or, on your pack and sort of pack it out that way. So that's the general process. But let's talk about like what are some things that you like to do to try to ensure that that meat stays as good as possible when you're trying to get it out of the field.
For sure. So really with the meat and the way that I look at it, to keep the meat as fresh and as tender and just untouched as possible, starts from knocking the deer down. So really, if you have an animal that's not stressed and you make a good shot and the animal drops right where he's at, or if you're hunting with a bow and arrow and he doesn't even know he's been hit, there's no stress, there's nothing running through the meat, through the blood or anything like that. So you're going to have a better tasting meat that way. So once you get the animal down, the thing that I like to do, and I'm sure most hunters are the same, you got to get those entrails out as soon as you possibly can. So one, that's going to cut down on the weight when you're dragging it out. And two, it's going to let that inside cavity and everything cool down. So the meat's going to start to cool down more so quicker than if it has the entrails inside of it. I've got one property to where the owner doesn't want me to leave the entrails in the field. So what I do with that is I take a trash bag with me and I'll gut it out in the field. I'll throw the guts in the trash bag, and then I will make 2 trips. So I'll take the deer back, and then I'll come back and get the trash bag. So, just out of respect for the landowner, you want to make sure that you follow their wishes. So once we get it out of the field, dragging it, honestly, if you can get it off of the ground and not drag it through the dirt and the twigs, then all that stuff is better. So, but generally, even when you do drag it, you're only going to get a little bit on the kind of flank meat with that. So it's not a huge deal, but out west, when you quarter it up, you need game bags. You need to cover that meat up, make sure it doesn't get dirt or anything on it. With the hearts, I'll take a Ziploc bag and livers, and I'll put that into the bag and just throw that inside the cavity as I'm dragging it out. That way I don't have a whole bunch of stuff taking up my hands. Trying to think. Really, as far as field care, that's about it. Just getting it out as soon as you can, getting it cleaned up as soon as you can, and getting hung as soon as you can. Once you get it back to the house and get it hung up, the thing I like to do is to get that hide off. I don't want to keep the hide on there because it tends to kind of the flavor, and it may just be a mental thing, or maybe I'm just putting everything to antelope, but the hide tends to so the meat tends to soak up flavor of the hide after it's been sitting on there. So I like to get that off. Yeah, it does dry out the meat a little bit if you let it hang for too long. So what I like to do is let it hang for a day, depending on weather. If it's not too hot, I'll let it hang for 24 hours, and then I'll quarter it up and throw it into a cooler on ice. And I don't put the deer directly on the ice. I'll put ice. I won't take it out of the bags. I'll put it in the bottom of the cooler, put a trash bag over that, put the deer on top of that, and then put another trash bag over the deer and put 3 to 4 more bags of ice on top of that. And then I'll drain it probably 1 to 2 times a day. And what that is, it gives you a little bit of moisture and it doesn't dry out your meat.
Yeah. So the idea of getting the hide off, the reason why I in my head like to get that hide off quickly is the idea that hide is there basically as a coat, right?
Mm-hmm.
For the animal. So I don't know how much actual flavor would get imparted like from the hide, but I look at it as, that whole hind quarter, the quickest way to cool it down is to take that jacket off, right?
Yeah.
So if we want to try to cool that meat down, we need to do everything we can to cool that meat down.
Of course.
To do it the absolute quickest way possible, it would be to debone all the meat, right? Because even those bones are going to help hold in some of that heat as well. But I don't know that that's like vitally important unless you are, backcountry hunting, and it's, warm out. I'm right with you. I try to get, I guess let's try to focus more on venison at this point, right? Deer.
Mm-hmm.
I try to get it out of the woods as quickly as I can, right? I don't want to let it sit there. And when I do that, I think about the weather for the next day or so. And if it's, when you think about that, it's not just, the temperature at night, or, you have to look at the temperature through each hour. And if it's going to
Mm-hmm.
be over 40 degrees, I like to take a bag of ice and actually throw it into the chest cavity, right?
Yeah.
Just to give that extra. And then something that I think has really helped the final flavor of our game meat lately, compared to, years past growing up hunting. I also think about the sun as well, right? Like if it's 40 degrees and that deer's sitting in the sun while it's hanging, that sun's going to be warming up that meat.
Yep.
So if you can keep it in the shade, that's also going to help as well. I don't do the cooler method once I break it down. I
Mm-hmm.
actually have a little refrigerator that I got, that was decommissioned at work, that I have here in the basement, and I put the quarters, in game bags and hang them in that refrigerator. It doesn't keep it quite as moist. I do get a little of that dried out exterior.
Yep.
Why do you think it's important to let that meat age a little bit? Like, because you could, if you wanted to, just cut it up and package it right, that day that you shot it, if you shot early enough.
Yep.
Do you feel like it's important to age? And if so, how long? Why do you do it? That kind of thing.
Gotcha. So yeah, I was actually going to touch on the bones when you mentioned about moaning it out and everything. So, with that, and that kind of goes in with the aging. So you're going to want to keep the bones inside the meat, or keep everything intact, because what happens is after that animal dies, the kind of rigor mortis kicks in. So if you pull it off of the bone, it kind of contracts, so your meat's going to be a lot tougher than if you would let it rest on the bone for 2, 3, 4 days. So you definitely want to keep the meat on the bone as much as you can, and let it rest that way or hang that way. Now, as far as aging, I don't age mine as much as a lot of people do. Kind of the going aging here, at least with processors, is about 2 weeks, 2-week hang time, which there's nothing wrong with that. But I prefer to do mine about 4 days, maybe 5 at the most. And I've found that it doesn't give it a very pronounced, strong flavor. So you don't get that, I guess you could, a lot of people call it gamey flavor, but it's just the matured flavor of the meat after it's been hanging. I prefer to have a little cleaner flavor within my game meat, and I've never had an issue, no matter what type of animal it was, whether it's mule deer, whitetail, antelope, elk, everything, as long as it's taken care of properly and not let it get wet or sit out in the sun like you mentioned. It's always been good on about a 4 to 5 day aging.
Yeah, I think that 4 to 5 days is important, because you mentioned the rigor mortis process, right? Where that
Mhm.
deer is going to get stiff. You have to let it get through that process, or that meat's going to be not extremely, but it's going to be tougher than it normally would be.
Yeah.
I look at the aging process less for building flavor and more for just allowing that meat to sort of tenderize itself, because some enzymes will start breaking it down.
Mhm.
The only time that I've ever felt like there was a strong gamey flavor to any of my venison was when it was not handled properly in the field, or as good as typical.
Yeah.
So that might be because it took me a little longer to find the deer. That could be that we didn't really pay as close attention to the outside temperature as we really should have, or like I said, that we used to let our deer hang in the sun and we didn't think about that. That kind of thing tends to lend itself to that sort of stronger flavor in my mind, as opposed to letting it age for a full 2 weeks. I'm sure there are some different flavors, 2 weeks compared to 4 days.
Yeah.
And when I say aging, for me, I don't want to sit here and act like I'm standing on a pedestal here and saying like, you have to age your meat this long. My meat ages as long as it needs to, for me to have time to be able to process it down and put it in the freezer. Sometimes that's 3 or 4 days. Sometimes that's 2 weeks. There's no hard fast rule for me. It's just purely, when am I going to have time to break this down into cuts? And if, like I said, if that ends up being 2 weeks, then it's 2 weeks.
Yeah.
It's just it's more of a timing issue for me, as opposed to trying to get on my high horse and say, if you don't age it this long, it's not going to be any good.
Yeah.
So, and really, like I said, it's more about just trying to get that meat as tender as possible, because listen, these are wild animals. They're moving around constantly. This isn't the, grain fed beef that's, barely walking around, and, and there's less fat and all that stuff. So it's going to be a little bit tougher of a texture just naturally. If we can age a little and let those enzymes break down that meat a little bit, it's going to help keep that tenderness. And real quick, I got to touch on this gamey flavor deal. That's something that just,
Oh
man,
boy, here we go, man.
listen, it irks me anytime that
Mhm.
someone says they don't like venison because it's gamey. Um, the ga- Gamey is this catch-all term that has no meaning whatsoever.
None.
What I want everyone to listen real quick to this. What you are tasting is flavor. Our palates in our current modern society are so bland, it
Yep.
is unbelievable. Um, you know, Thinking about beef, most beef you're eating from a cow that is under 2 years old. Uh, and when you have an animal that is that young, it's not going to have any flavor, right? Most chicken that people eat now is from a chicken that's less than 6 months old. There's no flavor there, right? Like, we have to add all these flavors to get, add spices, add all these things to something to make it taste good, because the meat itself has virtually no flavor.
Mhm.
The gamey Flavor is just that. It's flavor. It's not bad. It's good. That's, that is what tastes good in the meat. Right? Right,
Yes.
Paul?
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, there are, like you said, depending on how it is prepared in the field or how it is taken care of, there's going to be some flavors. Now, if you get a gut shot animal, that's not gamey. That's gut. Yeah, that's gross. But with like you said, with the meat that we're eating in the grocery stores and everything, I just challenge everyone listening, if you don't do this already, just next time you go to the grocery store and you pick up, let's say, something out of the freezer section, look at the ingredients in that and look at how much stuff is put into that meat or into that lasagna or whatever it may be that you grab. All that stuff in there is what makes it taste better. With wild game, salt, pepper, a little bit of the aging flavor, or just the flavor of the meat itself is all you need. And it is going to be the most delicious thing that you've ever tasted. And you just got to prepare it the same way that you would beef or lamb. I mean, really, it's red meat. So just prepare it any way you would any other red meat. There was something I was going to hit on and I completely left me.
It's all right. We'll come back to it because I want to move on to the sort of processing aspect, because that's the next step, right? Like,
Yep.
We've gotten it, we've aged it or dropped it off at a processor, right? There's times where I've done that.
Me too.
One of the deer that I shot this year, I dropped off the processor just because I looked at my schedule and was like, I will have no time. This meat will go bad before I can get it in the freezer. So this is my only option. Drop it off, get it deboned. That was just one less step that I needed to do to give me some time. So now I have this meat and I need to package it up and I need to store it, right?
Mm-hmm.
When you shoot, especially a deer, like, you're not gonna be able to eat all that meat before it goes bad if we just put it in the refrigerator, right?
Yeah.
So we have to freeze it. So my first question is, what do you recommend for people to store the meat so that it can be frozen and it can be fresh, months or maybe even a year later?
Gotcha. So what I do personally is I vacuum seal everything. So that way I get all the air and everything out of it. And it's going to keep a little bit longer than if you, at least in my opinion, if you wrap it with paper. There's nothing wrong with wrapping it with paper. I know there's a lot of individuals that do that. Processors do that as well. But I found that the flat vacuum seal bags, one, I can get more into the freezer, and then two, I can kind of position things in a way to where it circulates the freezing air through it to where it freezes quicker. So really, you want to get that meat vacuum seal, get the air out or wrapped up, and then put into the freezer and get it frozen as soon as you possibly can. If you have, I tend to keep a big thing of paper towels and I pat dry everything. That way there's no excess moisture in there that shouldn't be in there, because the last thing you want is any kind of crystals or anything on the outside of it. So really very simple. Get the air out, get it in the freezer, get it frozen as soon as you possibly can.
Yeah, and the big thing is you want to, like you said, get it you want to get it frozen as quick as you can. So I mean, in the perfect world, I would put this meat in a blast freezer.
Yeah.
Right, that just drops it to free to beyond zeros, like super quick.
Yeah,
those are expensive and big, and no one has those in their house. So your second best option then is going to be in a chest freezer or upright freezer. Your third option would be the freezer with your refrigerator, right? That, I mean, it's going to freeze it. It's just going to take longer. The reason why that's important, looking at this from a food science perspective, the longer it takes that meat to freeze, what you're freezing is not the meat itself. You're freezing the water, the moisture that's in that meat. The longer it takes to freeze, the larger the ice crystals are going to form, right? Like, as you freeze water to make ice cubes, it slowly happens and these little crystals form in there. The same thing's happening inside the meat. The longer it takes to freeze, the bigger those ice crystals are. And as those ice crystals form, they're ripping into the fibers of the meat, which is going to, if you would do it slow enough, or if you would freeze and thaw, you're creating this very mushy meat. So if we can do it very quickly, it helps to retain the proper texture of that meat. I'm like you, I vacuum seal everything. I love my vacuum sealer. For Christmas, my wife and I just got a whole big box of more bags. We vacuum seal virtually everything.
Yeah.
But in the past, we have done the, wrap in, saran wrap in plastic wrap, and then freezer paper over top. And that works
Yep.
good. It's
Mhm.
fine.
Oh yeah.
The reason why I like the vacuum seal bags is because, not on purpose, but I have lost a bag in the freezer for 3 years, and I decided, hey, I'm going to cook it and I'm going to try it. And it was not as good as fresh, right? But it
Mhm.
was still passable as edible, right? It
Yeah.
was still edible. It just gives me a longer time to be able to enjoy that meat, especially since my wife doesn't eat a lot of venison. So if I'm shooting 2 deer, it's going to take me a full year to eat, both of those deer.
Yeah.
I want to make sure that I have the best possible flavor and texture, with that. One more thing, you mentioned the reason why you like to um, do the vacuum seal is because of those ice crystals, right? That freezer
Mhm.
burn that we see on our frozen foods.
Yeah.
That is, again, going sort of nerding out with food science here. That is literally moisture being drawn out of that meat and
Yep.
refreezing on the surface. So again, that's going to alter the texture. If there's no air, if there's no room, no air drawing that out, that's not going to happen, right? So you need to make sure, even if you're using plastic wrap, you need to really make sure you're wrapping that super tight, getting as much of the air out as possible, or vacuum sealing. Do you do any, when you're doing this processing before you vacuum seal, do you do any like pre-prep to any of the meat to sort of help make it easier when you go to cook it, as far as building flavors on top of that game meat?
Yeah. So, well, when you mentioned pre-prepping, are you talking like pre-marinating, or are you talking about just? So, I don't pre-marinate anything, but when I do process my animals, I get all the silver skin, all that excess stuff that is not edible off the meat, to where pretty much I can just take it, thaw it out in the fridge, and then do whatever I want to do to it. Whether that's, for the flank, doing taco, like marinating that in olive oil and jalapenos, cilantro, a little bit of vinegar, and let that sit for a couple days. But yeah, I don't pre-marinate it. I find that it gives I'm not big on the texture if it's marinated for too long, especially if it's frozen marinated. Um, yeah, I put it all in fresh, and I just clean it up, and that way I don't have to clean it when I pull it out.
Yeah, so there, just to make my life a little easier before I go to cook, right? So there's two things that I do. Sometimes, and it's not with every piece of meat.
Hmm.
Sometimes I'll pre-salt and pepper or put some spices on it just so that it's there. So
Hmm.
literally it's thawed and I can go ahead and cook it however I plan on doing it. Uh, the other thing I do, sometimes I'll make that marinade, put it in the bag with the meat, and then just very, very carefully vacuum seal that bag, so that
Hmm.
once like I put it in the fridge and it's thawing, it's marinating as it's thawing, and all that. So again, it's just like, because sometimes I'm not the best at like thinking ahead, like,
Yeah.
oh, I need to get this out 3 days in advance because I need to marinate it for a day and a half type thing.
Mhm.
Now when I do that, I always make sure to label that bag with what I intended to make,
Okay.
because if I have a roast that I put a very specific spice mixture on, and then and I'm planning to make like a glaze for it or something like that, or a specific broth to cook it in with the Dutch oven. I don't want to forget that, right? And be like, oh, what was I going to do with this?
Hmm.
I'll label that very specifically. Uh, here's a big question that I've been thinking about for the last couple years, and I've experimented a little bit. So I'm curious on your thoughts before I share my experience. But ground meat, a lot of deer, a lot of venison, trimmings, things like that, right? You grind it up so it doesn't go to waste. Do you grind and then freeze, or do you freeze and then grind and cook?
So what I do is I grind and then freeze. So what I do is I get that meat as cold as I possibly can before I grind it, because you don't want it sticking to the metal when you're pushing it through. But yeah, I grind everything up, and with that, I do pre-season some, like the sausage, breakfast sausage, stuff like that. But Yeah, I definitely grind it before and then freeze it after that, because I like you, I don't have a whole lot of time. So if I pull it out and I plan to grind it, it's probably just going to sit in the fridge in cubes. So if I've got everything already pulled out, I just knock it all out in one fall swoop, vacuum seal it, and then I'm good to go.
Yeah, and I feel like that's what most people do, and that's what I did, right?
Mhm.
For years and years, I've started to experiment with just cubing up the meat, having just a little hand grinder that has the handle on it. You stick to the countertop,
Yep.
and I have to say, if I grind right before I cook, the texture seems to be a little bit better. Um, and
Yep.
so I've gone that route because it really only takes me an extra 5 minutes, I'd say, to grind up that meat. So
Mhm.
that's, this last deer that I just packaged up. That's what I did. I cubed it all. I weighed it out in, the 1 pound increments, put it in the bags, and put them in the freezer. So I would recommend to everyone to do that. I know it's not always feasible, but I also, it's a mind numbing experience for me to sit there with 20 pounds of meat and just grind and grind and grind. And
Yeah.
I'm not a huge fan of the packaging process, right? I don't do
Mhm.
it enough that I'm like, oh, I can't wait to do this. So to make that packaging process as quick as possible, that's definitely something that is high on my list. All right, I don't want to rush us too much, but at the same time, we need to get to the cooking part, right?
Yep.
Because venison's way different than beef. Even wild turkey is different than the turkey that you buy in the store.
Oh, yeah.
What, let's sort of focusing on just venison, just to keep this topic sort of the same. Like, what are some do's and don'ts with cooking venison that we need to sort of alter our mindset if we've only been cooking beef or we typically just know how to cook beef?
Mhm. So I think, like the biggest pet peeve that I've got, especially when it comes to venison steak, is overcooking it. That's the biggest thing that I see with a lot of individuals. Like, I mean, you can even research it online, and it's like, okay, make sure you cook your wild game to well done to make sure it kills everything. It was like, well, you just killed the game. That's what you did. You just completely destroyed it. Really, the venison is, again, it should be treated as far as like prepping, like cook time and temperatures and stuff, the same as beef and lamb. Now, where you get into the differences of the beef is, for one, the marbling, the tenderness of the beef. You're going to have more tender meat from beef than you will from venison, but that's just because there's not a lot of fat on the venison. So you're going to have a little bit of a tougher cut, but you just got to kind of understand that that's part of the meat itself. It's not anything wrong with it. It's not that you did anything wrong with the processing, but venison is a little bit tougher. Now, seasoning again is something I'm a salt and pepper kind of guy. I think that, the meat should be the focal point of the dish, not the seasoning. So I'll do salt and pepper on the venison. I'll cook it to about a medium for the kids. And if I want to add any extra flavors, I'll make a pan sauce. I'll do like, make stock with the bones and bring that down to a demi, and then use that with a red wine sauce or mushroom sauce or something along those lines. A bourbon mushroom cream is always good. So it's just getting the flavors with the venison, and really the way that I age it, and the way that I process it. I've given people venison and beef side by side, and it was hard for them to really tell the difference.
Yeah, when it comes to like spices and stuff, I mean, the only time I'm using anything other than salt and pepper is if I have a very specific recipe I want to try,
Mhm.
right? Like ossobuco or something
Yep,
like that. That then we're going to add other flavors to it because that's
of
just a
course.
very specific recipe.
Yep.
Um, when it comes to roasts or something like that, like if you're gonna throw something in the oven, what's your or in the crock pot, what's your method for that? Like, why is it important? And I guess I'm looking for a specific answer here. Why is it important for some of the cuts to be cooked in that situation as opposed to just throwing it on the grill or on the cooktop?
Yeah, no, definitely. So, I mean, with those tougher cuts, more active cuts, the shoulders, the parts of the back end of the animal. I mean, those are just they're very strenuous and chewy cuts. So you're going to have to put them in a slower cooking process to break down those fibers to where it's actually going to be palatable, and you're not going to sit there chewing on it for days on end trying to get it uh, broken up so you can swallow it. So really with those, the best method that I found, and you can probably attest to this too, Jason, is that when you're doing a roast, instead of just throwing it in the crock pot, covering it with vegetables and liquid and letting it cook that way, you're better off to season it up, salt and pepper, throw it in a pan, sear it on all sides. What that does is it's going to lock your juices of that meat in there a little bit better than if it would just throwing it in there. You're going to get a better flavor and a better texture from it as well. And you can use those pan drippings to throw back into the crock pot as well. So just make sure you sear the meat before you throw it into a crock pot or throw it into the oven and roast it. It's definitely going to make a world of difference.
Yeah, and I would also encourage everyone to, I'm not going to say throw away your crock pot because crock pots are great. But I would implore everyone to stop cooking wild game meats in the crock pot.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason why is because one of my favorite cuts outside of backstrap, tenderloins, that kind of stuff. One of my favorite cuts to eat on a deer is the neck roast, which is so tough. I mean, you look at it and you're like, why would anyone want to eat this unless it's ground down, right?
Yeah.
But when you cook it low and slow in a lot of liquid, it just fall apart tender. That connective tissue that's in there turns into a jelly that just makes everything so silky.
Mm-hmm.
The first time I tried to make it, I put it in the crock pot and it was no good. I mean, I cooked it on low for like 10 hours and it was edible, but it was not good. And it got me thinking, I started actually testing the temperature of a crock pot when it's on, when it's off. And the temperature fluctuates so much and it
Yeah.
heats up really hot and then cools down for a long period of time. So now, anytime that I'm doing any kind of crock pot recipe with venison, I'm using a Dutch oven and I'm putting it in the oven
Yeah.
because that has a more consistent temperature. I can keep the temperature of that oven at 180 and cook a neck roast for 8 or 10 hours, and it is just fall apart tender and so much better than if I throw it in the crock pot where that temperature is going to fluctuate between 200 and 225 degrees.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so definitely with the crock pot, and I agree with Jason on this one. I'm not a fan of crock pots. Honestly, I think I've used a crock pot 2 or 3 times in my life. My my wife really loves her Instapot, which that's a pretty good. That's a little bit better than the regular crock pot, but still, I find that no matter what you put in there, whether it's meat or potatoes or anything, you get like a metallic flavor, and I think that's from the fluctuation of the heat and not being a consistent temperature. If you put it in the oven, you're going to get such a better flavor. And with the Dutch ovens, I mean, those things are just absolutely amazing, and they're just, everyone should own one, at least one.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned, searing the meat. I mean, you can do it right there in the Dutch oven. And
Mhm.
then after I get all sides, I take the meat out. When I throw just a little bit of the stock in and scrape off those pan drippings a little bit,
Yep.
put the meat back in, put everything else in that I'm going to put in there. Sometimes it's veggie, sometimes it's just the meat itself. And then just let it go in the oven. It's absolutely wonderful, wonderful results. That doesn't take any more effort, really,
Mhm.
than the crock pot. It's just you're using the oven instead of the crock pot. Um, you One of the big selling points of the health aspect of venison is that, and all wild game meat, is that it has a low fat content
Yeah.
compared to store bought. Um, but that can be a detriment to cooking, right? Because fat is sort of like the great equalizer. I feel like for cooks that cook meat, for anyone that's cooking meat, it sort of gives you some wiggle room to not completely dry out the meat or make it super tough. So when it comes to that, other than just being very careful of the temperature we're cooking the meat at and cooking it to and not overcooking it, is there anything we can do or that you would recommend to help keep that meat sort of regulated or help to get the caramelization, that Maillard reaction around the outside of the meat? Um, are you in the camp of adding no fat, or let the wild game speak for itself, or is it okay to add a little bit of fat when we're cooking the meat?
Oh, it's definitely okay to add a little bit of fat. So what I would recommend though is if you're going to add fat to such a lean organic style meat, is make sure you get fat from a local farmer, something that hasn't been processed, something that hasn't been run from the other side of the country over to you, that you have no idea how old it is or how long it's been there, or what they've done to that animal. So just get a good relationship with local farmers in your area, and get, whether it's, I like pork fat. So, I mean, even bacon, I did one recipe to where I put a back loin from the venison on the Traeger, and I slow cooked that for probably 6 hours, I think. But I took bacon and stuffed it into 4 different slits with that. And then I stuffed that with garlic, sage, and truffle butter. And I let that cook. Yeah, it was phenomenal, absolutely delicious. But it definitely gave a little bit more of uh, I guess a tender note to it, but also added some of that smoked flavor with it as well from the bacon.
Yeah, I mean, there are some people out there that are hardcore about, hey, this is wild game meat. Don't contaminate it. Air quote there, contaminate
Yeah,
it
contaminate.
with domestic fats or meats. Hopefully, if people don't already know this, this will open some eyes. You really can't use the fat on deer to cut into your ground meat or to cook with. It leaves a waxy texture on your
Mhm.
tongue and in your mouth. It's tallow, it's not fat.
Yep.
So, I mean, in the perfect world, if, I would shoot a couple deer and a bear every year, and I would use that bear grease as the fat, and
Yep.
everything would be wild. I've never shot a bear. And I don't foresee myself shooting one every year. Right. So sometimes you need to sort of take a little bit of shortcuts, and I'm with you. That pork fat, locally sourced, it's going to provide you with the flavor. It's going to provide you with that little bit of extra that's going to be absolutely wonderful texture. I've already alluded to one of my favorite recipes, which is a neck roast. Do
Mhm.
you have any favorite recipes that you're big on?
Oh boy, there's so many different ones that I really enjoy, but I would have to say probably my favorite one is the one that I mentioned to you just a minute ago. Is the one that I did on slow smoke or slow cook on the Traeger. Just a basic loin roast from the back end, and stuffing it with the bacon and garlic, sage, and truffle butter. I mean, it just turned out absolutely phenomenal. And you can again add that with a bourbon garlic cream sauce over underneath it or on top of it, and you can't go wrong with that.
When you were explaining that, man, it's like, man, that sounds so good.
I'll send you a picture of what it looked like, and
uh,
you can see.
yeah, we'll talk a little later. I have a smoker as well, so we'll talk a little later.
Yeah,
Maybe
yeah, definitely.
trading some more recipes. Paul, thanks for coming on. I really appreciate this. Real quick for everyone, how can they find out more information about Sizzlin Arrow Outdoors and your podcast and all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, definitely. So you can find best way to connect with me really is through our website, which is www.sizzlinarrow.com. And it's got a lot of great information on there, blogs, write-ups, reviews. It's got my email, phone number, all that good stuff. So you can connect with me through that. I can be found on pretty much anywhere you listen to podcasts: Apple, Spotify, Pandora, Sizzlin Arrow Outdoors podcast, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube. I'm on there at Sizzlin Arrow, so you can check that out. And I actually have a fabrication video of how to skin out and kind of take out the back straps of a deer that we got up in Michigan. So you can check that out if you're interested in that too.
Hey, Paul, thanks for coming on, and good luck this week with your mentors.
Hey, thanks, Jason. I appreciate it, man. We got a couple big ones out there that we're looking to knock down. So hopefully, fingers crossed.
Good luck to you, man.
All right, thanks, buddy.
Before we keep going, a real quick question for you. Are you concerned with urban sprawl? Are you concerned with the threat of our increased human presence has put on wildlife and wild spaces? If so, an easy next step for you to try to help with this situation is to visit our Patreon page and become a monthly supporter. If you like this podcast, if you would like to help form a new nonprofit that helps combat and mitigate the effects of urbanization, visit patreon.com/conservethewild. That's patreon.com/conservethewild. Go visit today and become a sponsor. That'll do it for this episode. Thank you for listening. Thank you to Paul for coming on. This was a great conversation. This is something that we could have gone on for hours and hours about, just the cooking of venison, and then, of course, other wild game as well. I would definitely say that we will be revisiting this topic, sharing some more tips and do's and don'ts, and then also talking about some other sources of wild game, more so than just venison. We just sort of wanted to focus on really the one type of game that is most pursued in the United States. Make sure you check in the episode description, check out the links that are provided there, check out Sizzlin Arrow Outdoors. Paul's doing some great work with that. And give Sizzlin Arrow's Outdoor podcast a listen. The shameless plug. Back in early November, I was a guest on his podcast. So a little shameless plug there, but give it a listen. It's another great podcast. If you enjoy this one, you're going to enjoy that one. And speaking of enjoying this podcast, if you enjoy it, you want to support it, you want to support the nonprofit status that we are seeking for Conserve the Wild, make sure you click that link to visit our Patreon page. There's a little bit of swag that you'll receive based on your support level. Lastly, same as every episode, get outside, take someone with you, and always stay wild.